Welcome, everyone, to the August 31st edition of Trail Talk Live. With us today is Rob Stewart to talk about plant propagation. Rob has been with Master Gardeners since 2014, and as well, he's a member of the Ottawa Valley Rock Garden and Horticultural Society. He grows most of his plants from seeds and recently has been experimenting with starting new plants through spores, cuttings, division, and layering. Just a reminder to please enter any questions you may have for Rob in the chat, as many of these will be answered as is possible within the time frame. Take it away, Rob.
Well, thank you, Mary, and welcome to everyone to today's talk. So yes, as Mary mentioned, today's talk is going to be on plant propagation, and specifically we're going to look at how to grow ferns from spores. Most of you will be familiar with seeds, but I'll just go over that again and give you some other little tips about how to make your seed sowing more successful. And with respect to cuttings, I'm going to be looking at bushes or shrubs using half-ripened and vines, using half-ripened wood or stem cuttings. And I'm also going to be looking at the use of layering. So in this photograph, I have photos of 4 different types of ferns. In the upper left-hand corner, I've got a male fern. Then we've got a marginal shield fern, a Japanese painted fern, and I forget the name of that one. That's unfortunate. Anyway, you can see from the photos that there's these little capsules on the bottom of the leaves, underneath the leaves. And this is where, these are the spore cases where the spores are produced. And if you take a close look, you can see the colors are light green, light brown, maybe a gray color. So here's the Japanese painted fern in a little closer picture, and you can see them quite easily on the edges of the fern in a sort of a chevron type of shape, whereas on the marginal shield fern, they look like small little wormy caterpillars that are trying to hide from their parasitic friends. But this is where the spores come from. And these photos were taken approximately the 3rd week of June. And this is the same. This is the Japanese painted fern taken about 2 to 3 weeks later, around the 7th of July. And you can see now how those spore cases have turned dark brown. So that means they're in a position where it's worthwhile testing to see if the spores are ready to be released. And one of the ways you do that is you take a small piece of the fern leaf, and in my case, I put it into white envelope so you can see what is released, and I leave that overnight. And in the morning when I got up and I opened up the envelope, you can see all the fern spores on the bottom of the envelope and up the sides, and there must be tens of thousands of them within this little envelope, and they're very, very tiny. So now that you've got your spores, and they will be released at different times by different types of plant, the first thing that you need to do is to take some soil and basically sterilize it. And the way that you do this is that you take your soil, you make it damp, put some boiling water in it to make sure that the soil absorbs as much moisture as possible. And then you bake it in the oven for about 30 minutes at 250 degrees. And this is long enough to kill most of the pathogens and most of the little critters that would give your spores a competition and would prevent them from making the ferns. Once you've done that, you can take your soil, you can put it into your pots. I use a container system, a propagating system that I bought from Lee Valley, and I can show you that at the end of the presentation. But basically, you put now once the soil's cooled down, you put it into the container, and you very carefully sprinkle a little bit of spore over each cell. And the next thing is key is that you soak the cells from below. You don't want to wash the cells off the top of the water and have off the top of the soil and have them go into the edges of the pot or the cells, so that it creates well, basically they'll be underneath and they won't germinate, they won't produce. The next step is to label that and maybe identify the type of fern. Once you've done that, you can cover your cells. And now, as I say, I used a propagator that I purchased at Lee Valley, and it comes with a clear plastic cover. And you want to take that and your unit, put it outside in the shade on the north side of your house. Or what I tend to do is put it under grow lights so that it doesn't get disturbed by any of the critters outside. Because of the way it's designed and because there's nothing particularly growing, you only need to check the soil level weekly. It's not something that you need to do every day. So the first thing that'll happen is you'll see a small green covering start to move across each of your cells. And that'll take about 4 to 6 weeks, maybe a little longer, but within that time frame. And when that happens, that's the the step where the male and the female organs are produced. And it's at that point in time that you want to start misting your cells daily, because that gives the small little male spiral the opportunity to uses the water to find the female organs and to fertilize the female organs. So at that point in time, you'll wait another 4 to 6 weeks and you'll start seeing ferns appear. And you can grow them on until they're about 1 inch tall. Then they can be pricked out and potted into pots and put into a shady place where they'll allow them to continue to grow. So this is a photo on the left of the type of cell I used in the past. The one I used this summer is a slightly different configuration, but it's the same type of thing. And this is the little Prothalia growing all over the bottom or all over the cells. And the picture on the right-hand side is what they look like. They look like a little bit of moss, but they've got some rough edges to them. And when you see that, as I mentioned previously, that's when you start to spray them with water. And then 4 to 6 weeks, this is what they look like. The Prothalia have spread out across the surface of the cell, and now they've started to form little ferns, baby ferns. And at that stage, then you just grow them on. You can do that and open up the cover, take the cover off, and allow them to get used to the humidity in the room, and then continue on with that. The next type of approach is using. This deals with seeds, and seeds are a good thing where you know that the plant that you're trying to grow come true from seed. You will find, for example, if you're trying to grow hybrid, take the seeds of a hybrid tomato as an example, they won't come true from seed. So collecting the seeds from the plant in those cases doesn't give you the same plant as before. And you'll find that in a lot of plant material that's been hybridized or mainly hybridized as an example. So you'll need pots. I use 7-centimeter pots. And they're about the same 7-meter square, about the same depth. I use some soilless mix that's got some perlite in it. And I also add an additional perlite to make a mixture that's about 25%. What you're trying to do with the perlite is to allow more space between the soilless mixture, so you'll allow air into the mix to which the plants need to grow. The other thing I do is I use a grit or a coarse sand to place on the soil after I've sown the seeds. I have some labels and a marker so I can identify the date that I sowed the seeds, and some information about the name of the plant, and maybe some information about the germination routine that I need to follow. Now, not everybody does this, but I like to put my little pots into Ziploc baggies, and but that helps to reduce the amount of watering that I need to follow up with going forward after they're sown. And they usually will not need watering for at least a couple of months. So it's a good thing. I'm not always on them every time, and I don't want them to dry out and have the seeds die. So I find this works very well. The other thing is a cooling rack, which I use after I've soaked the pots, and then let all the water drain out. And the tray is just to move a number of plants to a place where I'll store them to let them germinate. So basically, I've covered a lot of the material here already. I do let the pots drain for about 48 hours. I don't want a saturated soil in those pots because that'll basically kill the seeds. I want it thoroughly moist all the way through, but I don't want it to be totally saturated. If I'm growing seeds that germinate quickly, I'll check every couple of days. If they're slower, I might check once a week type of thing. But even if I miss by a couple of days, because they're growing in the closed baggie, that gives me some flexibility. The other thing that I want to mention is when I zip the bags up, I leave the edges open. I don't close it completely. I want a little bit of airflow to allow some air to come in, some additional oxygen, and that seems to help. The other thing I find is that if I open up the baggie, once I notice that they're germinating, but I leave it around the pot. I don't take it away, and slowly after a couple of days, I'll open it more, and after 2 or 3 days, I can remove the baggie completely. What I do then is I grow the seeds or the seedlings until they form the first true leaves. And at that point in time, depending on the size of the plant I'm growing, I can transplant into other pots and grow them on, or I can continue until they get to a reasonable size that I can deal with. I don't want them being too small. Now, one of the sites that's very important, I find very important and very useful, is the Ontario Rock Garden site, where they have information on rock garden protocols. And here's an example of different types of campanula. And there's this particular Campanula carpatica. White clips is a common plant that you can grow. And the instructions say, sow at 20 degrees Celsius, seed germinates within 3 months. So that gives you an idea of what to do. This other Campanula, Carpatica turbinata alba, it requires a different regime. So it says sow the seeds at 20 degrees Celsius for 6 weeks, then 4 degrees Celsius for 6 weeks, which your fridge is an ideal temperature to reproduce that temperature. And then you can put the seeds outside or raise it slowly. Now, I find these types of seeds, if I sow them in the fall, like in October, they'll get the 6 weeks of 20 degrees before the season cools down. They'll get the temperature and the cold temperature over the winter, and in the spring they'll germinate. So anyway, but one of the interesting things about this site is you need to know the Latin name of the plants, but that's not hard to find if you Google the name of the common name. You can usually find where the Latin name is, and then you can use the site at the Ontario Rock Garden site to give you that information. Here's a pot that's been soaked. I've got my name on it and my information. I sowed it the 2017, the 9th of whatever, September probably, and it's ready to go into its Ziploc bag. Here it is in the Ziploc bag. I don't know if you can notice, but it's opened at this end and at this end, and it's closed in the middle. And the number I put here is I sow a lot of seeds every year, so I just put the last digit of the year there. So when I'm going through and looking at my pot or my seed pots, I can quickly determine which ones I should throw that haven't germinated or other ways. Now we're going to talk about cuttings. There's different types of cuttings. There's softwood cuttings, semi-ripe cuttings, and hardwood cuttings. typically I'm just going to deal with semi-ripe cuttings, which are ready in later part of June, early July. And it's basically when the current year's growth has finished, but it hasn't really hardened. And I'm going to look at Daphnes, Clematis, and Rose in this particular case. Hardwood cuttings are something like yew cuttings that you could take in December. So the material I use is I use a coarse sand mix or a soilless mix with 2/3 perlite, a lot more perlite in this case than I did with the seeds. Use pruning shears to collect the rooting hormone, the cuttings, some rooting hormone to treat the cuttings. So an artistic brush to apply the rooting hormone, some labels, a small cup, put the rooting hormone in, because when you finish putting the rooting hormone onto the cuttings, what's left you throw over so it doesn't contaminate the original supply. There's a pot, a very large Ziploc or a clear plastic dome, and if you're using the large Ziploc, bamboo skewers to keep the cuttings away from the edge of or the leaves of the plant. So here's an example of some cuttings of dogwood, just to give you an idea of the size of the cuttings. So here's a cutting I took with all the leaves on it, and you can see they're about the same size as an average pencil. And at the bottom, I've cut off the extra leaves, and I've trimmed the stem to just below a leaf node, so that there's a little bit of a bulge in the leaf, in the stem at this point in time, and that's what I've done. And I've also trimmed the leaf edges so that they don't lose a lot of moisture through transpiration. And this is basically the fork, I mean the artistic brush I use, and the rooting hormone that I'll apply to the bottom, sort of half a centimeter or so of the cutting. Here's an example of Daphne Briggs Moonlight that I took. This is the mother plant. I took a bunch of cuttings in about the middle of July. This is them. I take them and I put them into a Ziploc so that they don't lose, they lose as little moisture as possible. And you also want to try to take it earlier in the morning so that the cuttings have as much moisture in them as possible. In this case, I've prepared the cutting, clipping off the lower leaves and leaving some of the ones at the top. And then I'll put these back in the Ziploc bag for a couple of hours, and letting the wounds where I've taken off the leaves or I've trimmed the cuttings to harden up and heal. And this is what it looks like when I put that mixture, when I put those cuttings into the soil, that I've treated them with the hormone compound. I just put them in the soil, and I make sure that it's in good contact with the material in the pot. This is an example of a Clematis cutting. And this was the cutting I took from the plant, which is about 30 centimeters in length. This was the middle cutting. So I cut it here above this set of, halfway between this leaf node and this leaf node, and halfway between the leaf node at the bottom and the one in the middle. Then what I've done, similar to the dogwood cuttings that I showed you before, I trim all the leaf nodes or the leaves off at the bottom node, and I trim it up just above the leaf node at the top and remove the excess leaves. And I may or may not trim up this leaf depending on what it is. Then I'll put these cuttings into the pot, making sure that if I'm using a sand mixture, what I usually do is I'll cut a piece of newspaper or a couple of sheets of paper, put it at the bottom of the pot, so that when I fill it with the sand mixture, all the sand doesn't run out. I'll soak it and get it all wet, and then let it drain. And after that, I'll put in the cuttings. This is an example of a rose cutting, and it's following basically the same technique. I've cut off some of the extra rose leaves, and I've trimmed it just below a leaf node. And you basically use the same approach as with the other cuttings. And this was done around the same time, mid-July. The new growth has grown, but it's not overwhelmed. And one of the things about that you should be note about rose cuttings is that if you're trying to propagate a hybrid rose like a tea rose, you'll get the roots, but you should be aware that hybrid roses are grafted onto hardier rootstock. So even though you may get the roots growing from your hybrid tea cutting, that cutting won't live over the winter. The roots will die and the cutting will die. So this will work with species roses, explorer roses, those types of things, but not likely with the results won't be there with hybrid tea roses. So here's an example of the cutting of the cover, the plastic cover I have over my cuttings, and they're sitting in this case in my basement. I've got some lights that I use to allow them to go on. And this is another case where I have a pot. You can see the bamboo skewers that keep the bag away from keep the bag away from the leaves, so it doesn't produce any kind of rotting on the leaf edges. Oops, sorry. I'm not sure that I have enough time to really go on with the layering technique, so I'm going to have to leave that for another session. But what I did want to show was that, this is the propagation unit that I purchased at Lee Valley. It has an area in the bottom to hold water. These are the little cells I fill with water. This is a measuring device that determines the amount of water in the container, and these are the various cells. Now they sell it as a plant propagator, and obviously it would work for that. I find with the ferns it really works well. So if you're thinking of doing it and you want to make a lot of cuttings, that's the way to go. Anyway, that's as far as I'm going to go today. If there's any questions, I'll turn it over to Mary.
Oh, that was terrific. Thank you so much. That was a really interesting talk. It's Rebecca here, and we do have a few questions for you. Catherine was asking, with the fern spores, how long do they remain viable once you've collected them?
I would think a couple of months, probably. I don't exactly know. I know when I collect them, I tend to sow them right away. But yeah, I don't know. I'm sure that if with a lot of other things like seeds, if you stored them in your freezer, that would ensure that they'd probably be good in a year. But I don't know exactly on that, unfortunately, on that question.
They're different from seeds. They don't have the germplasm in them that seeds have to provide nutrition.
Yeah.
But storing them in the freezer, good suggestion. Another question relating to ferns was, it sure looked like you had hundreds and hundreds in that propagation tray. So how many would you actually get from sowing a full tray like that?
I would normally get, I would say, it depends at what time I take them out of the cells. If I take them out when they're really small, I would probably get, I would say 5 or 10 per cell, because you're always disturbing them when you take them out, and some of them you won't have the proper roots developed. But I wait till they're a little bigger, and I might get 2 or 3 per cell. But it's amazing, even when you try to sow the spores as thinly as possible, there's just so many of them. They're so tiny that it's really hard to keep the numbers low. But you know,
And
they're,
very
they're
much a game where patience is the
yes,
name of the game,
yeah.
right?
But I mean, it's patient, but it's not something that you need to spend a lot of time worrying about. You can just put them in a corner and they'll do their thing, and just check them every once in a while.
We have several questions about cuttings from fruit trees,
Mhm.
or sorry, cuttings in general. And the first one is somebody is interested, Kimberly is interested in how to take a cutting from an apple tree.
I would follow the same approach as with as I did with the Daphne and the rose. That once the growth on the apple tree has slowed down, you would take it off and treat it basically the same way as you would the Daphne or whatever. You want to get it as a mid semi-ripe cutting.
So basically this year's wood, but later in the season.
It would be this year's wood. I would say it would be not at the very beginning. It'd probably be around the same time frame, late July maybe. I guess it depends on, like I have an apple tree that it never seems to stop growing. So, I mean, it's a different situation there, but as long as the cutting isn't hard and snaps when you take it, which would be later in the season, you should be okay.
Okay. And then what about storing? Because it can take months for the cuttings to the wood cuttings to root. So how would you store them over the winter?
Well, I guess there's two things. Is normally I find it takes maybe 4 to 6 weeks for it to start to show the roots. For example, that rose cutting I showed you, it rooted within 3 weeks. Like it was really, really quick. And I've been able to transplant it into a bigger pot. And as long as that pot's buried in the soil so that it doesn't, it's not sitting above the soil, it should be hardy enough to survive the winter. The other, I had a problem last year with Clematis where I had a number of cuttings that rooted around the same, I think about a month. And one of the things that you know that your cutting is starting to take is that if you try to pull up on the cutting that when it's in the pot, once you feel a little bit of resistance, you know that it's starting to form roots. If it comes up easily, just leave it alone, tamp the soil around the cutting again and leave it. But once you find you need extra effort to pull it out, you know that it's starting to root. And all the cuttings don't root at the same time. So you can wait at some point in time, open up the pot, repot the ones that haven't rooted, and take the ones that have and put them in a little pot. And the key thing, I think, is to make sure that they're in the ground over the winter so that they're not subjected to the freeze and thaw temperatures that you will get if it's sitting above the ground.
I'm going to just jump in here and say we have 2 minutes left. So time for one more or two really quick questions.
All right, question from Sandra about why do you put sand or grit on top for seed propagation? And what type of sand or grit do you use?
You can use coarse sand, which is referred to as or horticultural sand. Up until last year, I would purchase the bags of sand that you would use for a sand filter for swimming pools, which was a really, really good even mixture. When I bought it last year, they had a lot of mixtures of different sizes, and some of it was too fine. But the reason I put the grit on top is to prevent the growth of moss and other types of growth on the top of the seed pot. And I find that if that top layer is dry, the soil will be moist underneath. It prevents that moss from growing, and then there's less competition for the seeds to germinate.
Do we have time for one last one, Mary?
Really quick.
Okay. How about Floribunda roses? Now they are kind of a hybrid by definition. Could you do cuttings with them?
I would try with those. I don't know that they've been grafted. I think that the criteria is the grafting, because what they've learned is that sure, a hybrid tea will live well in Tennessee or Southern Ontario, but it won't do well where we are, and so or the northern part of the States. So that's why they've grafted them onto sturdy rootstock. But I would try it. I mean, you've got not much to fail, and it's and if it succeeds, then you've got a plant that you can plant in your garden in the year or so.
Rob,
Yeah.
thank you so much. You are such a wealth of information, and it's really inspiring to think about all these different ways to grow new plants. So I'm sure everybody's walking away with lots to think about. Rebecca, thank you for your help with the questions, and thanks to all of you for joining us. A reminder that we are here again next week. Rob, if you want to forward it, I believe we have a pollinator garden visit with Julianne Labreche. So hope you can all join us then. Thank you.